"Shut up, old lady. Nobody cares about you." The words hit Margaret Whitmore like a slap across the face, but she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She stood there on that sidewalk, 76 years old, holding her grocery bags, and looked at the three young men blocking her path with the kind of calm that only comes from a life that has already survived the worst it has to offer. And then she reached into her pocket and made one phone call. Not to the police, to her son. Before we go any further, if you are watching this right now, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Because what happened next on that sidewalk in Clearwater Ridge, California, changed everything. Margaret Whitmore had lived on Birchwood Lane for 41 years. She had raised a son there, buried a husband there, and watched the neighborhood around her change in ways she couldn't always control and didn't always understand. She had seen young families move in and old neighbors move out. She had watched storefronts close and new ones open. She had shoveled the same stretch of sidewalk every winter and planted the same flowers every spring until the flowers became as much a part of the street as the pavement itself. People who knew Margaret knew one thing about her. Above everything else, she showed up. When Dorothy Hargrove across the street had her hip replaced and couldn't drive for 6 weeks, it was Margaret who appeared at her door every Tuesday and Thursday with groceries and company. When the Mendoza family, 2 doors down, lost their oldest boy to a car accident 3 summers back, it was Margaret who organized the meal train, coordinated with the funeral home, and sat with Elena Mendoza until 2 in the morning on the worst night of that woman's life. When the elderly man at the end of the block, Harold Birch, who had lived alone since his wife passed, started forgetting to eat, it was Margaret who noticed first and started bringing him dinner 4 nights a week under the pretense that she had simply made too much. Margaret never asked for credit. She never kept score. She did what she did because she believed in the marrow of her bones that people were supposed to take care of each other. That was the whole point of being alive, in proximity to other human beings. But there was one thing Margaret had never quite learned to do for herself: ask for help. That Tuesday afternoon in October, she was coming home from Greer's Market on 5th Street, the one she'd been shopping at since before it had the self-checkout lanes, before the prices went up, before the parking lot got repaved. She had 2 bags in her hands, nothing heavy, mostly produce, and a box of the oatmeal her doctor kept reminding her to eat more of, and she was moving at her own pace down the sidewalk outside the old Café Remy, which had been a hardware store when she was younger and a laundromat before that. She almost didn't notice them at first. 3 young men, maybe 19, maybe 21, gathered on the stretch of sidewalk between the cafe's outdoor tables and the street. They were loud in the way that young men in groups often are, not because they had anything important to say, but because volume felt like authority. They were passing something between them, laughing about something that didn't require an audience but attracted one anyway. Margaret kept her pace steady and moved to one side to give them room to pass. They didn't move. She slowed down. She glanced up. The one in the center, the tallest one, was looking at her with the particular smirk that belongs exclusively to people who have never yet experienced serious consequences. "Excuse me," Margaret said, politely. The way she had said "excuse me" 10,000 times in her life, in grocery aisles and parking lots and crowded theaters. The tall one tilted his head. "You talking to me?" "I'm just trying to get through," she said. He took a small step to the left, but not to move out of her way. Just to mirror her. Just to stay in front of her. His 2 friends had noticed now and had adjusted their posture accordingly, pulling themselves up straighter, angling their bodies toward her, performing toughness for each other the way young men do when there's someone smaller present and no one to check them. "I think you got plenty of room," the tall one said. "You just don't want to use it." Margaret looked at him steadily. She had spent 76 years reading people. And what she read in his face wasn't malice, exactly. Not yet. It was the specific kind of carelessness that comes from a person who has never looked directly at someone older and thought about the life that person had lived. He didn't see a woman. He saw an obstacle, a prop. "I'd like to get home," Margaret said. "That's all." "Yeah, the second one." Shorter, with a red cap pulled low, stepped forward. "And what's stopping you?" "You are," she said simply. That landed wrong. She could see it in the shift of his jaw, the way his chin pulled back slightly. He hadn't expected her to say it plainly. Young men like him expected flustered apologies, nervous retreats, the shuffle and duck of someone trying desperately not to make things worse. What they didn't expect was a 76-year-old woman looking them square in the eye and naming exactly what was happening. Redcap stepped closer. "Maybe you should watch how you talk," he said. "Maybe you should remember who you're talking to," Margaret replied. The tall one laughed then, and it was a different kind of laugh, sharper, meaner, the kind designed to strip something away from a person. "Who are we talking to?" he said, spreading his hands in exaggerated bewilderment, playing to his friends, playing to the three people who had paused at the cafe tables and were watching without intervening. "Some old lady carrying groceries?" "Nobody special," the third one echoed and laughed. "Shut up, old lady," Redcap said. "Nobody cares about you." Margaret absorbed those words the way she had learned. Over a long life, to absorb many terrible things without letting them find purchase, without letting them plant themselves somewhere they could grow. She took a breath. She thought about Harold Birch at the end of the block. She thought about Elena Mendoza. She thought about every person she had sat with in the dark hours of their lives who had believed, in those moments, that they were invisible. She thought about how wrong they had been. And she thought about her son. The tall one, she would learn his name later. Brandon Keller, 19 years old, 2 prior arrests for disorderly conduct, nothing that had yet risen to the level of genuine consequence, took another step forward and reached out. His hand closed around the chain at her neck. The pendant that hung from that chain was not an expensive piece of jewelry. It wasn't gold. It wasn't set with stones. It was a small silver disc, barely an inch across, with a simple engraving on the back, 3 words and a date. Robert Whitmore had given it to her on their 30th anniversary, laughing when he pressed it into her palm, because he said he could never figure out what to buy her, that she never wanted anything for herself, so he had made something that was specifically and only about them. She had worn it every day since his funeral. Brandon Keller wrapped his fingers around it and yanked. The chain snapped. Margaret's grocery bags hit the pavement. One of the apples rolled free and bumped against the leg of a cafe table. She steadied herself, one hand reaching for the wall behind her, and she felt the place where the chain had been, a faint soreness at the back of her neck where the clasp had caught. She looked at Brandon. He was holding the pendant up, turning it in the light, squinting at it, like he was trying to assess its value. "Not worth much," he said, and dropped it in his jacket pocket anyway. The people at the cafe tables were fully watching now. Not one of them stood up. Margaret noticed this without judgment. She understood fear, understood the particular paralysis of witnessing something and not knowing how to place your body in relation to it. She bent down slowly and began picking up her groceries. "That's it," Redcap said. "Good girl. Pick it up." Margaret picked up the apple. She placed it back in the bag with deliberate care. She straightened up, adjusted both bags in her hands, and then she reached into the right pocket of her jacket and took out her phone. Not shaking, not fumbling, just her hand and her phone and a number she knew better than her own address. "Who you calling?" Brandon asked. Some of the bravado in his voice had thinned, the way it does when a bluff starts to feel less certain. "My son," Margaret said. Brandon looked at Redcap. Redcap looked at the third one. And then they all laughed. Because the idea of this woman's son being any kind of threat was genuinely funny to them. It was the funniest thing they'd heard all afternoon. "Oh yeah?" Brandon grinned. "Call your son, lady. We'll wait." Margaret didn't react to that. She just pressed the call button and lifted the phone to her ear. It rang twice. He picked up on the second ring. "Mom." His voice was calm the way a river is calm above a waterfall. "What's going on?" "I'm outside Cafe Remy on 5th, Margaret said. "I'm fine, but I need you to come." A pause, very short. Half a second at most. Are you hurt? Another pause. Shorter. I'm on my way. She put the phone back in her pocket. She looked at Brandon Keller and his friends, who were still half lawing but quieter now, reading her with a new uncertainty they couldn't quite name. You should probably go, she said. Why's that? Brandon said. Because my son is coming, she said. And you really don't know who that is. The laughter came back then, louder this time, the way it does when people are covering something. But Margaret noticed, she always noticed, that none of them actually moved away. They stayed right there, planted on that stretch of sidewalk, because moving would have looked like the one thing they needed to avoid looking like. Afraid. So they stayed. And Margaret set her grocery bags back down on the pavement because her arms were tired, and she pressed her back against the wall of Cafe Remy. And she waited. She had raised Ethan alone for the last 8 years of his childhood. Robert had gotten sick when Ethan was 10, a slow sickness, the kind that takes its time and makes you negotiate with time in ways you never expected to. And by the time Robert died, Ethan was 17 and had already learned the particular fluency of grief that children of dying parents develop. How to be present without making it about yourself, how to hold someone up while you're still learning to stand. He had been a complicated teenager, not wild exactly, but restless. The kind of restless that comes from having too much energy and not enough containers for it. He had struggled in school, not because he wasn't smart. Margaret had always known he was smart, sometimes ferociously so, but because he was the kind of smart that didn't fit neatly into the shape school required. He needed to move. He needed to build things. He needed his hands and his body to be part of thinking. He had found motorcycles at 19, the way some people find religion. Margaret remembered the afternoon. He brought the first one home, a second-hand Harley he had spent 4 months saving up for from 3 different jobs, and the way his face looked when he stood beside it in the driveway. She had recognized something in his expression that she'd been watching for years. Not pride exactly, though that was there too. More like relief. Like he had finally found the shape his particular kind of energy fit inside. She had been afraid for him then. Afraid in the way mothers are afraid when their children discover something powerful, something that gives them a sense of self larger than what they've been allowed before. She had seen the news stories. She had the same instinctive associations most people had when they heard the name Hell's Angels danger. Violence, the wrong side of every line. But she had also watched what actually happened. She had watched Ethan find, in that brotherhood, the thing she had spent his entire childhood trying to give him. A sense of belonging that asked something real of him in return. Not just warmth, not just community. Accountability, a code. The kind of structure that had actual weight, that required something that you couldn't opt out of when it got difficult. She had met the men he rode with, met them properly. At dinners and events and the occasional charity run for a veterans organization or a children's hospital. She had watched them with the same quiet attention she brought to everything. And what she had seen was not what the news stories prepared you for. She had seen men who had, in many cases, no other family worth speaking of, who had found in each other something that functioned with all the weight and loyalty and occasional frustration of blood relation. Did she agree with everything? No. Did she worry sometimes? Yes. Always. But she had watched her son become someone she was genuinely proud of, and she had learned slowly to trust her own eyes over the pictures other people painted. Outside Cafe Remy, she stood and waited. Brandon Keller had stopped laughing. The other two had drifted slightly apart from him, the way people do when they start to feel that the ground underfoot might not be as solid as they thought. There was a couple at the cafe table nearest to her who were openly watching now, a woman in her 40s with her phone out, recording, who had clearly decided that whatever happened next needed to be documented. "How long's your son gonna be?" Redcap asked. His voice had shifted register. Something in it was working to sound nonchalant and landing about 20% short. Margaret looked at her watch. "About 12 minutes now," she said. "We should just go." The third one, the quiet one, who had barely spoken, said to Brandon, "We're not going anywhere," Brandon said. But his jaw was tighter than it had been. You could give me back the necklace, Margaret said. Brandon looked at her. What necklace? The one in your jacket pocket, she said. My husband gave it to me. His name was Robert. He died 14 years ago. The engraving on the back says, still here, still yours, and the date of our 30th anniversary. She paused. You could give it back right now and go home, and this could still be the kind of day you learn something from. Brandon stared at her. There was something happening in his face that was more complex than a 19-year-old with his particular history knew how to handle. Or, Margaret continued, you could wait. She let that sentence hang there with no conclusion. Brandon reached into his jacket pocket. His hand closed around the pendant. He held it there for 3 full seconds. Margaret counted, and then he pulled his hand back out and crossed his arms over his chest. We'll wait, he said. Margaret nodded once, as if this was the answer she had expected. They waited. She heard them before she saw them. Anyone who has spent time around motorcycles knows that sound, that deep, chest-level rumble that you feel before it fully resolves into something your ears can organize. It starts as a vibration, almost geological, something below the register of normal city noise, and then it builds, separates, becomes recognizable as the sound of engines, multiple engines, coordinated and unhurried. The couple at the cafe table looked up. The woman recording lowered her phone slightly, then raised it again. The cafe staff member, who had come to the doorway, a young man, maybe 25, who had been hovering uncertainly for the last 15 minutes, leaned out further. Brandon Keller heard it too. Margaret watched his face without turning toward the sound herself. She watched his eyes change. She watched him track the sound as it grew, as it became unmistakable, as the rumble separated into distinct units, 1 engine, 3 engines, 7 engines, more, as it filled the street from end to end like something alive and purposeful, and entirely unconcerned with anything except the one destination it had. She watched the exact moment he understood that he had made a mistake. It didn't come all at once. It came in pieces. First, his chin dropped slightly, just a fraction. Then his shoulders changed, that subtle downward shift that happens when the scaffolding of bravado loses a support beam. Then his eyes found hers, and what she saw in them was the beginning of something he had probably not felt in a long time. Real fear. Not the performed discomfort of being caught at something minor. Not the social embarrassment of being seen doing something you'd rather nobody saw. The older, more biological variety, the kind that your body produces when it understands, faster than your brain can catch up to, that you have placed yourself in a position that is genuinely, concretely dangerous. Who did you call? He said. His voice was almost a whisper. I told you, Margaret said. My son. The first bikes came around the corner and onto 5th Street. 9 of them in the lead formation, and they moved the way rivers move, not rushing, not threatening, just inevitable. At the front, slightly ahead of the others, wearing a leather vest with the Hells Angels patch on the back, and the kind of presence that certain people carry without appearing to try, was Ethan Whitmore. He was 43 years old. He had his father's height and his mother's eyes, and somewhere along the way, he had acquired the particular stillness of a person who has learned that the most powerful thing in almost any room is someone who doesn't need to raise their voice. He wasn't racing, he wasn't weaving or revving or performing anything. He was just coming down 5th Street on a Tuesday afternoon to find his mother, and the 9 men behind him were coming for the same reason. And the additional dozen that materialized from both ends of the block a minute later were coming for the same reason. Because Margaret Whitmore had called her son, and her son had not come alone. Ethan pulled his bike to the curb 20 feet from where his mother was standing. He cut the engine. He swung off in one smooth motion and took 3 steps toward her and stopped. Mom! He looked at her face. Her neck, she saw him clock the redness at the back of her neck where the chain had snapped, and something moved through his eyes so fast it was almost impossible to catch. I'm fine, she said. You sure? I'm sure. He held her gaze for another moment, reading her the way she had always read him, thoroughly, quietly, in the language that runs underneath words, and he appeared to satisfy himself that she was telling the truth. Then he turned around. The street had gone completely quiet. Brandon Keller and his two friends were standing exactly where they had been because there was nowhere to go now. The block behind them had two bikes pulled across it, with riders still seated, and the cafe entrance had two more men standing just to the side of the door, not blocking it, just present. Ethan looked at the three young men for a long moment. He didn't threaten them. He didn't posture. He didn't do any of the things that Brandon Keller had spent his life associating with male confrontation. He just looked at them with the same calm his mother had shown them 20 minutes earlier, and the silence stretched, and the rumble of the last few engines that were just now cutting out left a ringing quiet behind it. "Which one of you has her necklace?" Ethan said. His voice was completely even. It could have been a question about directions. Nobody answered for 3 full seconds. Then Brandon Keller's hand moved to his jacket pocket. "I asked a simple question," Ethan said. "One of you has something that belongs to my mother. I'd like it back." Brandon's throat moved as he swallowed. He pulled the pendant from his pocket. He held it out. One of the men from behind Ethan stepped forward, not a young man, maybe 50, built like a man who has spent his life doing physical labor, and took it from Brandon's hand and walked it back to Margaret without a word. Margaret took it and closed both hands around it and pressed it to her sternum for just a moment. "Thank you, Ray." "Yes, ma'am," Ray said, and stepped back. Ethan looked at Brandon. "You want to tell me what happened here?" Brandon opened his mouth. "And I want the truth," Ethan said, "because there's a woman at that table who's been recording since before we got here, and whatever you say, I'm going to find out if it matches." The woman with the phone who had, in fact, been recording for most of it shifted in her chair and said nothing. Brandon's voice, when it came, was barely recognizable as the same voice that had said, "Shut up, old lady," 25 minutes ago. We were messing around," he said. "We didn't mean anything." "You took her necklace," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "I didn't think it was." "You took her necklace," Ethan said again. Same tone, same pace. "And you told her nobody cares about her." The quiet on 5th Street had a texture to it. The people at the cafe tables, the staff member in the doorway, the driver of a car that had slowed to a crawl trying to navigate around the bikes, all of them were completely still, in the way that people become still when they understand they are witnessing something they will remember. "Yeah," Brandon said, and the word dropped out of him like something he'd been holding with both hands and finally lost the grip on. "Yeah, we did that." Ethan nodded slowly. He looked at his mother. He looked back at Brandon. "You saw an old woman," he said. "You figured she was alone. You figured she was nobody. You figured the worst thing that could happen to you was her feelings getting hurt." He paused. "Look at where that thinking got you." Brandon looked at the bikes. He looked at the men. He looked at his two friends, who were studying the pavement with extraordinary concentration. He looked at the woman with the phone. He looked at everything except Ethan's face. "Look at me," Ethan said. Brandon looked at him. "My mother has lived on Birchwood Lane for 41 years, Ethan said. She's fed people in this neighborhood who didn't have enough food. She's sat with people who were dying. She's shown up for people who had nobody else. She's been doing that her entire life quietly, without asking for anything back." He let that sit for a beat. "And today she had to call me because 3 of you blocked her on a sidewalk and took a piece of jewelry she's been wearing since her husband's funeral." He stopped. He drew a breath through his nose. "The police are on their way," he said. "That woman's video is going to them. Whatever happens next is between you and them." He tilted his head slightly. "I'd suggest you stay right where you are." He turned back to his mother. "Mom, how about I take your groceries?" Margaret handed him the bags. He carried them without ceremony to where his bike was parked and set them carefully on the back, and then he came back and stood beside his mother while the wail of the first police siren was up somewhere on the far side of the block. Behind them, more than 24 men who had dropped whatever they were doing on a Tuesday afternoon and ridden across Clearwater Ridge because one of their own had called, sat quietly on their bikes or stood beside them, not saying a word, not making a move, just being exactly what they were, the people who showed up. Brandon Keller stood on the sidewalk outside Cafe Remy and waited for the police. And in the long minutes of that waiting, with the evidence already recorded and the witnesses already steadied in their seats, and the crowd that had quietly gathered at both ends of the block, he had the look of a person encountering, for the first time in his life, the full weight of what it means to pick the wrong person to make feel small. Margaret Whitmore reached up and pressed the pendant back against her collarbone, still smudged with the pocket lint of a stranger's jacket. Chain still broken, but hers, always hers, and she let out a breath that had been in her chest since the moment the clasp snapped. Ethan felt her exhale and looked down at her. "You okay?" he said. "I'm okay," she said. "You sure you're not hurt?" "Ethan," she said, with the patience of a woman who has answered this question 10,000 times over 43 years of motherhood. "I'm sure." He nodded. He put his arm around her shoulders. Gently, she leaned into him the way she had leaned into him when he was small and needed holding. And she thought about how the physics of comfort changes, but the need for it never does. "I want you to know," she said, "that I had it handled." Ethan made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I know you did, Mom. I just thought you'd want to be here." "I did," he said. "I really did." The police cruisers were pulling around the bikes now, officers stepping out and scanning the scene with the particular calibrated alertness of people who have been called to a situation they're still assembling the shape of. Margaret watched one of them take in the row of motorcycles, the vests, the number of men, and do the rapid recalibration she had seen people do many times over the years, the moment when the story they arrived with stops matching the scene in front of them. One officer, a woman, maybe 35, with dark hair, and the kind of gait that signals someone who has been doing this long enough to not be afraid of what she doesn't know yet, came directly to Margaret. "Ma'am, are you the one who was assaulted?" "One of us made the call." "Yes," Margaret said. "I'm Margaret Whitmore." The young man in the red hat and the one in the gray jacket were present for the whole thing. "The taller one, the one with the dark hair, he's the one who took my necklace." The officer looked at Brandon. She looked at Ethan. She looked at the 24 men on and around their bikes. She looked back at Margaret. "Can you walk me through what happened?" she said. "Of course," Margaret said, and she did. Calmly, precisely, in chronological order, the way she did everything. The way she had always done everything. Without drama, without exaggeration, because the truth, in her experience, was always enough. The cafe tables had a story to tell. The woman with the recording on her phone had footage that covered most of it. The staff member in the doorway had seen the whole thing from the moment Brandon's hand reached for the chain. The police took their statements one by one. The three young men stood to one side with officers beside them. And Brandon Keller had the look by now of someone who understood that the morning he'd woken up imagining today was a very long time ago. Margaret watched it all unfold with the same quiet attention she brought to everything. She was tired, her feet ached, and her neck was sore, and she still had groceries to put away. But underneath the tiredness was something solid, something she had carried for a long time without quite naming it. She looked at the pendant in her hand. She thought about Robert. She thought about the way he used to sit in the kitchen in the morning before anyone else was up, just sitting there with his coffee and whatever book he was halfway through, and how she would come downstairs and he would look up and smile the way people smile at something they are genuinely glad exists. "Still here," the engraving said. "Still yours." She pressed it once more against her sternum. Then she looked up at her son, who was standing 20 feet away, answering questions from a second officer with the same steady composure he always brought to everything hard. And she thought about the boy who had come home at 19 with a second-hand Harley and a face full of relief, and the man he had grown into, and the 41 years she had spent on this street, and all the people she had fed and sat with and held up in the dark. She thought about Brandon Keller's face in the moment he understood what he had done. She thought about how he had looked at her, really looked at her for what was probably the first time since he'd blocked her path. She had spent a long time being overlooked, being underestimated, being the kind of person people assumed had nothing and no one, because she was old, because she was quiet, because she carried groceries instead of weapons. But the people on Birchwood Lane knew better. And now, on 5th Street, outside Cafe Remy, with the afternoon light going amber, and the police radios crackling, and 24 motorcycles lining the curb, and the woman at the cafe table still holding her phone with the footage safe inside it, a whole street was learning. What a whole street of neighbors had always known. Margaret Whitmore was not alone. She had never been alone. She had simply been so busy taking care of everyone else that it had taken this particular afternoon, this particular set of 3 young men and 1 broken chain to make that visible. Officer Diane Reyes, she had introduced herself properly, name and badge number, the kind of thoroughness that Margaret immediately respected came back to her after completing her initial round of statements. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I want to make sure I have this right. You called your son, and he arrived with—" She glanced along the row of bikes, briefly lost count, started again. "More than 20 members of my son came," Margaret said simply. "His family came with him." Reyes looked at her for a moment. "His family," she repeated. "That's right," Margaret said. Something shifted in the officer's expression, not softening exactly, but adjusting, recalibrating the same way she had when she'd first driven up. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I think I understand." She probably did understand, Margaret thought. Or at least she understood enough. "We're going to need you to come to the station tomorrow morning." "If that works," Reyes said, to complete the formal statement. "This is an assault charge, and with the recording we have, it's solid. But we want your account on the record properly." "I'll be there at 9, Margaret said. "I'll let them know." Reyes paused. "Is there anything else you need tonight?" Margaret thought about it for exactly 1 second. "Can someone give me a ride home?" she said. "I've got groceries." Reyes almost smiled. Ethan, who had heard this from 6 feet away, was already walking toward her. "I got it, officer," he said. He picked up the bags from where he'd set them by his bike. He looked at his mother. "You want a ride or you want the car?" Margaret looked at the motorcycle. She looked at her son. "How fast are you going?" she said. "As slow as you need," he said. Margaret considered this. "The car," she said. "I have eggs." Ethan's face broke into the first real smile of the afternoon. "Ray," he called. "Can you take my bike?" Ray, who was 53 years old and had been riding since before Ethan was born, responded without looking up from the conversation he was having with 2 other members. Already figured. Ethan shook his head, still smiling, and offered his mother his arm. And Margaret Whitmore, 76 years old, with a broken chain in one hand and a pendant pressed to her chest and 2 grocery bags of produce and oatmeal on their way home with her son, walked down 5th Street through the gap in the motorcycles with the particular bearing of a woman who has never needed anyone to tell her that she mattered. She already knew. She had always known. It had just taken this afternoon to make sure the rest of the street knew it too. The police station on Garfield Avenue smelled the same way it had always smelled: burnt coffee and old paper, and something underneath both of those things that Margaret could never quite name, but that she associated, without being entirely sure why, with the particular exhaustion of people who'd spent their days dealing with the worst hours of other people's lives. She arrived at 8:55, 5 minutes before she'd told Officer Reyes she would come, because Margaret Whitmore had been early to every appointment of her life, and she was not about to break that particular streak on account of 3 boys who didn't know whose mother they'd chosen to humiliate. Ethan had offered to drive her. She had told him she'd take a cab. Mom, Ethan. That was the end of that conversation. She sat in the waiting area with her purse in her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and she watched the morning activity of the station with the same unhurried attention she brought to everything the officer at the desk arguing, quietly into a headset about a scheduling conflict. The young couple near the window filling out paperwork with the grim concentration of people performing an unpleasant task they can't postpone any longer. The bulletin board on the wall near the hallway that was layered with flyers and notices. Some recent, some clearly months old. One of the flyers caught her eye. It was faded at the corners, printed on yellow paper, the kind of flyer that gets put up with genuine urgency and then slowly forgotten as urgency becomes background noise and background noise becomes invisible. It listed a phone number for reporting elder abuse. At the bottom, in smaller print, if you or someone you know has been targeted, pressured, or intimidated, you don't have to handle it alone. Margaret looked at that last line for a long time. Officer Reyes appeared at 8:58. She was in the same jacket as the day before, or one exactly like it, and she had the look of someone who had been at this desk since before 7. Mrs. Whitmore. She extended her hand. Thank you for being on time. Let's get started. The formal statement took 40 minutes. Margaret gave it the same way she had given it the day before chronologically, precisely, without embellishment, because she had learned over 70 years ago that embellishment was what defense attorneys fed on, and she had no interest in feeding anyone who was going to work on Brandon Keller's behalf. Reyes had the recording from the woman at the cafe. Her name, Margaret now knew, was Patricia Souza, 47 years old, a nurse who had been on her lunch break and whose phone had captured 8 solid minutes of footage, including the moment the chain snapped. The footage was clear. The audio was better than anyone could have reasonably hoped for on a Tuesday afternoon on a busy street. The DA's office is reviewing this morning, Reyes said, with the recording and 3 corroborating witness statements. We're looking at assault charges minimum, theft as well. The necklace, she checked her notes, was recovered. You have it back, but the act of taking it is still on the record. Good, Margaret said. Reyes looked up from her notes. Mrs. Whitmore, I want to ask you something, and you can tell me if it's none of my business. Ask, Margaret said. Yesterday, before your son arrived, were you afraid? Margaret thought about it genuinely. She gave the question the respect of actual consideration rather than the reflexive answer that was available, the one about not being afraid, about staying calm, about knowing her son was coming. I was angry, she said finally. There's a difference. Reyes nodded slowly. There is. I've been afraid before, Margaret said. I know what it feels like. This was different. I was angry because I've spent 41 years on that street, and those boys looked at me and saw nothing worth respecting, and that she paused, choosing the next word carefully that offended me. On my own behalf and on behalf of every other person they've ever looked at the same way. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something else? She said. You can. The men who came yesterday, the Hells Angels. She held the name neutrally, carefully. A woman who had spent enough time in law enforcement to know that the picture and the reality had a complex relationship. How many of them were your sons? Family, Margaret said. That's the word. Family, Reyes repeated. I counted 27, Margaret said. Though there may have been more toward the end. I wasn't counting carefully by then. Reyes wrote something down. We've had no complaints from yesterday, she said. The crowd stayed back. Nobody was approached or threatened. Nobody interfered with our officers. She looked up. That was deliberate, I assume. My son is a deliberate person, Margaret said. Something moved in Reyes's expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. I got that impression, she said. What Margaret did not tell Officer Reyes, not because she was hiding it, but because it had not yet fully taken shape as something she understood, was what she had seen from Harold Birch's room window 3 weeks before the afternoon outside Café Remy. She had been bringing Harold his Tuesday dinner, same as always pot roast that week, because it was the first cold week of October and Harold's circulation was poor, and hot food mattered more than it used to, and Harold had been agitated in a way she hadn't seen before, not confused. Harold was 81 and sharp enough to finish the crossword in pen every morning. This was a different kind of agitation, the kind that comes from knowing something and not knowing what to do with the knowing. Margaret, he'd said, before she'd even set the container down, something's been happening on this street. She had sat down across from him at the kitchen table, because 41 years of knowing when someone needed you to sit had taught her not to rush the moment. Tell me, she said. What he told her came out in pieces the way difficult things usually do, non-linearly, circling back on itself, certain details louder than others, but the shape of it, when she held all the pieces together, was this. In the past 3 months, at least 4 of the elderly residents on it and around Birchwood Lane had been approached by a man Harold described as being in his mid-30s, well-dressed, articulate, friendly in the particular way of someone who has practiced friendliness as a professional skill. He called himself a representative of something called Clearwater Property Partners. He carried a briefcase. He had business cards. He had paperwork, not the kind you're expected to sign immediately. He was always careful about that, but the kind that makes the conversation feel official and the possibility of refusing feels somehow impolite. What was he offering? Margaret asked. Buyouts, Harold said. Said the company was interested in acquiring several properties on the east side of Birchwood. Voluntary sales. Good prices, he kept saying. Very good prices. He paused. He said the neighborhood was changing, and it was better to get ahead of the change than be left behind by it. Margaret sat with that phrasing for a moment. Who did he go to, she asked. Evelyn Morse at number 44. She's 83, Margaret, and she lives alone since her daughter moved to Portland. And she told me she was so confused after the man left that she called the number on his card and asked him to come back and explain it again. Harold's jaw tightened. He came back twice. Did she sign anything? I don't know. She won't say. He looked at his hands. Jerry Patel. At the corner house. He's 78, heart condition, and the man came to him in the middle of a week when his son was out of town. Jerry told me the conversation went. He said it went fine. But then he stopped talking about it. Just stopped. And you? Margaret said. Harold looked up at her. He came to me 3 weeks ago, he said. Sat right there. He nodded toward the chair where Margaret was sitting. Very polite. Very calm. He kept calling me sir and asking about my health, my family, how long I'd lived here. Like he was building a case for something. He paused. And then he put the paperwork on the table and said that the properties that came onto the market first would get the premium offers. That the window wasn't going to be open forever. That I should think about my situation and what made sense for a man in my position. A man in your position, Margaret repeated quietly. Alone, Harold said. That's what he meant. He meant I was alone and old, and eventually I would need arrangements, and that this money could make those arrangements comfortable. His voice had gone very flat, the flatness of someone holding something tightly. He never said anything I could point to as a threat. But I felt the entire time he was here. I felt like something was being decided about you, Margaret said. Harold looked at her. Yes, he said. Exactly that. She had gone home that night and thought about it for a long time. She had thought about the yellow flyer at the police station, though she hadn't been to the station yet at that point. She would learn about it later, and about the particular mechanics of what Harold was describing. The way it was designed to feel voluntary, while applying pressure that was anything but. The way it targeted people who were alone, or whose family was far away, or whose health made long-term decisions feel urgent in ways that a younger person's decisions don't. She thought about Evelyn Morse, 83 years old, calling that number back because she was confused and didn't want to seem rude. She thought about Jerry Patel going quiet after a week when his son was out of town. She thought about all the people she knew on Birchwood Lane who would not, under ordinary circumstances, ask for help. Because they'd been taught, the same way she had been taught, that not needing help was a kind of virtue. That independence was its own armor. She had started making her rounds differently after that. Not obviously. Not in a way that would make anyone feel managed or observed. But she had started paying attention in a more intentional way to the quiet signals canceled plans, shorter conversations at the door, the particular quality of distraction that belongs to someone carrying something they haven't put into words yet. 3 days after the conversation with Harold, she stopped by Evelyn Morse's house under the pretense of dropping off a book she thought Evelyn would enjoy. Evelyn answered the door, looking like someone who had not slept well, which was notable because Evelyn Morse was constitutionally one of the most well-rested people Margaret had ever met. I'm fine, Evelyn said before Margaret had asked. I know you are, Margaret said. I brought you this. It's wonderful. She held up the book. Evelyn looked at it, and then her face did something complicated, and she stepped back from the door and said, Do you want to come in for tea? The tea took 2 hours. What Evelyn told her in those 2 hours was longer and more frightening than what Harold had described. The man from Clearwater Property Partners had come back 3 times. Each time, the paperwork had been different, more specific, more official-looking, more full of language that Evelyn couldn't parse without her reading glasses and couldn't fully parse even with them. Each time, he had been warm and patient and slightly more explicit about the timeline. Each time, he had mentioned, in passing, the names of other residents on the street who had already made decisions and were in a much more comfortable position. Were the names real? Margaret asked. I don't know, Evelyn said. Some of them sounded familiar, but I don't know if he was. I don't know. Did you sign anything? A long pause. There was a form, Evelyn said. He said it was just an expression of interest, not binding. She looked at her teacup. I signed it because I didn't want him to think I was being difficult. Margaret set down her own cup carefully. Where is it? She said. He took it with him. Margaret stayed calm. She stayed calm because Evelyn needed her to stay calm, because the older woman across the table from her was already trembling slightly with the particular shame of someone who suspects they've made a mistake but doesn't yet know the size of it. And the last thing she needed was confirmation that the size was large. All right, Margaret said. Here's what we're going to do. First, we're not going to worry about that form until we know what it actually says. Second, tomorrow morning, you're going to call your daughter in Portland. She'll worry. She should worry, Margaret said, gently but without apology. That's what daughters are for. Evelyn looked at her. I signed it, Margaret, she said. I signed something without reading it properly, and I didn't tell anyone. And now, Evelyn. Margaret put her hand over the older woman's hand on the table. You trusted someone who presented himself as trustworthy. That's not stupidity. That's not weakness. That's what happens when someone uses a suit and a briefcase and a friendly voice to take advantage of people who were raised to give strangers the benefit of the doubt. She paused. The mistake was his, not yours. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were wet at the corners. You always know what to say, she said. No, Margaret said, honestly. I just know how to listen until the right thing comes. The morning after Margaret's formal statement at the police station, she came home to find a car she didn't recognize parked in front of her house. It was a dark gray sedan, not a police cruiser, not a personal vehicle she associated with anyone on the street, not a trade vehicle. Just a dark gray sedan with the particular anonymity of something chosen deliberately not to stand out. A man got out as she came up the front walk. He was, as Harold had described, in his mid-30s, well-dressed. The kind of face that was calibrated to project competence and warmth simultaneously. The kind of face that takes effort to maintain and shows the effort only if you know what to look for. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, with a smile that arrived exactly on cue. My name is Daniel Forsyth. I'm with Clearwater Property Partners. Do you have a few minutes? Margaret stopped on the front walk, 2 feet from her own front door, and looked at him. She took in the briefcase, the business card he was already extending, the posture professional, relaxed, practiced. She took in the timing. He had come the morning after she'd filed a police report. The morning after 27 members of the Hells Angels had sat on their bikes on 5th Street outside Café Remy while 3 young men waited for the police to arrive. The morning after, she was fairly certain, word had traveled through whatever channels this kind of word travels through, that Margaret Whitmore had made a noise. I know who you are, she said. The smile stayed in place. Very well constructed. I'm glad my reputation precedes me. I've been speaking with several of your neighbors over the past few months, and I thought it was past time I introduced myself to I know about Evelyn Morse, Margaret said. The smile didn't falter, but something behind it did, just slightly, just enough. I'm not sure I know what you mean, he said. I think you do, she said. I think you know exactly what I mean. I think you've been working this street for 3 months, and I think you've been deliberately choosing people who live alone, who have health concerns, whose family is far away, who won't pick up the phone and call a lawyer before they sign something. Forsyth's expression shifted into the next gear. the one reserved for moments when warmth alone wasn't going to be sufficient. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you may have concerns, but I assure you that everything Clearwater Property Partners does is completely. Give me your card, Margaret said. He stopped. You already started to hand it to me, she said. Go ahead. He handed her the card. She looked at it. She memorized the information on it with the same attention she had always brought to details that mattered. Then she looked back at him. I'm going to make a phone call, she said. And then, if I were you, I would very carefully consider who you've spoken to on the street, what you've said to them, what you've asked them to sign, and whether everything about that process is as completely above board as you're about to tell me it is. She paused. Because if there is even one person on this street who signed something they didn't fully understand, under circumstances that I would describe as pressure, you're going to need to have a better morning than this one. She turned, unlocked her front door, and went inside. She heard the gray sedan start up 40 seconds later. She went straight to the phone. She called Ethan. I need your help, she said. Not the same kind as yesterday. He was quiet for a second. Tell me, she told him. All of it Harold Evelyn. Jerry Patel, the forms Evelyn had signed. The man who had just been in her front walk. The business card in her hand. She told it in order and without editorializing, because Ethan processed information best when she gave it to him clean and let him assemble it himself. When she finished, the silence on his end lasted about 4 seconds. Does he have any idea? Ethan said. About you? About anything. He knows I'm not someone who's going to sign something without reading it, Margaret said. He doesn't know the rest. Okay, Ethan said. I need to make some calls. Don't do anything else today, Ethan. Mom. And now, his voice had a quality she recognized, the quality that Robert's voice had sometimes had, that specific register of someone who loves you and is asking you to let them carry something for a while. You've been carrying this for how long? She calculated. About 3 weeks. 3 weeks, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something more complicated than that. And I didn't want to worry you. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a son who is choosing not to say several things at once. Let me make some calls, he said finally. I'll come by tonight. I'll make dinner, she said. You don't have to, Ethan. It was her turn. I'm making dinner. He came at 6:30 with Ray, who Margaret had privately always found to be the most grounded of Ethan's people, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, and whose silence was never empty, and with a woman Margaret had not met before. Her name was Carmen Vasquez, and she was 38 years old, and Ethan explained, a real estate attorney who had been doing pro bono work with the chapter for 2 years. Margaret liked her immediately. Carmen had the business card Margaret had kept. She had the name Clearwater Property Partners written on a legal pad in front of her. She had a legal pad that, over the course of the next 90 minutes around Margaret's kitchen table, she filled with notes that grew steadily more focused and more grave. This is a pattern, Carmen said, not for the first time in her career, but with the particular weight of someone who had been hoping it wasn't. The voluntary language, the incremental documentation, targeting isolated elderly residents, using social pressure to drive signatures before anyone can consult a lawyer. This is a pattern I've seen before. Is what they're doing illegal? Ethan asked. Parts of it are potentially predatory under California elder financial abuse statutes, Carmen said. The question is what they've actually collected, what the documents say, and whether any of the signatures were obtained through undue influence. She looked at Margaret. I need to talk to every person this man approached, starting with the one who signed something. Evelyn, Margaret said. She's 83 and she's embarrassed. You'll need to go carefully. I will, Carmen said. But I need her to know, whatever she signed, it's not the end of the story. These things can be challenged, especially if she can demonstrate that she didn't fully interest in what she was agreeing to, or that she was pressured. Margaret thought about Evelyn sitting across her kitchen table 2 weeks ago, hands wrapped around a teacup, saying, I signed it because I didn't want him to think I was being difficult. She didn't understand it, Margaret said, and she was pressured, not overtly, but the kind of pressure that doesn't leave fingerprints. Carmen wrote something down. Ray, who had been quiet through most of this, spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. How many properties is this company trying to acquire? I don't know, Margaret said. Harold mentioned 4 people who'd been approached. I've identified 2 more since then. But I don't know how many are on the east side of the street alone, and I don't know if Birchwood is the only street. The kitchen went quiet. Ethan was looking at the business card. Daniel Forsyth, he said. You know the name? Carmen asked. No, he said, but I will. There was something in his voice that was not a threat. It was quieter than a threat, more settled. The tone of a person who has made a decision and is already moving past the moment of making it toward what the decision actually requires. Margaret watched her son in that moment, this man who had come into his own in ways she hadn't fully predicted and couldn't entirely account for. This man who had found his code and lived inside it with a consistency she deeply respected, and she felt something that took her a moment to name. She felt proud. Not the soft, reflexive pride of a mother watching a child perform at something. The harder, more specific kind. The kind that comes from watching a person you love navigate something genuinely difficult and do it right. There's something else, she said. Everyone at the table looked at her. She had debated whether to say it tonight. She had turned it over for the past 3 days and had not been able to determine whether it was the kind of thing you voice before you're certain or whether the voicing of it was itself a kind of action she wasn't ready to take. But sitting at this table with these 3 people, she decided that carrying it alone for 3 more days was worse than naming it unfinished. The 3 young men from yesterday, she said. Brandon and the others. What about them? Ethan said. I've been thinking about where they were standing, she said, in front of Cafe Remy, which is 3 buildings down from the Clearwater Property Partners temporary office that opened on 5th Street 6 weeks ago. The silence at the table changed quality. I don't know if it means anything, she said carefully. I don't know if they have any connection to Forsyth or his company. Young men without much to do sometimes end up blocking sidewalks just because nobody's taught them better. But, Ethan said. But Forsyth came to my door the morning after, she said. He knew my name. He knew where I lived. And the boys, they weren't random in the way that random usually looks. They were there for a while. They were watching who went in and out of the buildings. She had the full attention of everyone at that table. Carmen's pen had stopped moving. Ray had set down his coffee. Ethan was very still. I might be wrong, Margaret said. And I want to be wrong. Because if I'm not wrong, then what happened to me wasn't just 3 bored kids being cruel. It was something designed. Something meant to make me feel small and watched and unsafe on my own street. She paused. On the street I've lived on for 41 years. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Carmen said quietly, Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to write down everything you've told me tonight. Everything about Forsyth, about the neighbors, about what you observed. All of it. All right, Margaret said. And I want to call someone, Carmen said. A colleague. She works in elder financial abuse cases specifically, and she has contacts at the DA's office beyond the standard channels. If what you're describing is what I think it might be, she stopped herself. Let me make the call first, before I finish that sentence. Margaret nodded. Tonight? Ethan said. Tonight, Carmen said. Ethan looked at his mother. The kitchen light was warm, and the dinner dishes were still on the table, and it was an ordinary Wednesday evening in every way except for the fact that it wasn't ordinary at all. Mom, he said, why didn't you tell me sooner? The question was genuine, not hurt, not accusatory, genuine. The question of a person trying to understand something. Margaret thought about it. Because I've spent 41 years taking care of this street, she said. And I think somewhere in there I got the idea that needing backup was the same as failing. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. That's the same thing you always used to tell me, he said. When I was 17 and trying to carry everything alone after Dad died. Margaret looked at him. You told me, he said, that asking for help was how you showed respect for the people who loved you. Because it gave them a chance to do what they wanted to do anyway. The kitchen was very quiet. Margaret remembered saying that. She remembered the specific afternoon, a Sunday. Late winter, Ethan standing in the kitchen with his jaw set and his eyes red and insisting he was fine. He was handling it. He didn't need anyone to worry about him. She had sat him down and said exactly those words. She had believed them when she said them. She still believed them. She had just, somewhere along the way, forgotten to apply them to herself. "You're right," she said. Ethan held her gaze. "I know," he said, not unkindly, with the gentleness of a son who understood that this admission cost something. Outside, the October night had gone fully dark, and the street was quiet, and somewhere 2 blocks over, a dog was barking at something it had probably already forgotten, and the neighborhood was doing what it always did, continuing, breathing, persisting, while inside this kitchen, something that had been hidden for 3 months was finally in the light. Carmen's phone was already out. Ray was looking at Daniel Forsythe's business card. And Margaret Whitmore, who had spent her entire adult life being the person other people called when they needed someone to show up, sat at her own kitchen table and let the people who loved her show up for her. It felt, she would think later, like the hardest thing she had done in years. And also somehow like a relief so deep it had its own kind of weight. Carmen's colleague called back at 11:17 that night. Margaret knew because she was still awake, had been awake since Ethan and Ray and Carmen left at 9, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold, turning the business card over and over in her fingers the way she used to turn her wedding ring when she was thinking through something difficult. Daniel Forsythe, Clearwater Property Partners. The gray sedan parked in front of her house with its engine running for those 40 seconds before it pulled away. She heard Carmen's voice in her memory. "Let me make the call first." Before I finished that sentence. Carmen had not finished that sentence. Margaret had a feeling she was going to need to be ready for what came after it. Her phone rang at 11:17 and it was Ethan. "Carmen's contact knows the name," he said without preamble. Margaret set down the business card. "Tell me." "Clearwater Property Partners has been flagged before. Different city, different street, same model. They came into a neighborhood in Riverside 18 months ago, mostly elderly residents, several of them living alone, and ran the same playbook. Friendly representative, incremental paperwork, voluntary language, pressure that doesn't leave fingerprints." He paused. 11 people signed over property rights before anyone figured out what was happening. 3 of them were contesting the sales for the better part of a year afterward. One of them, a woman, 81 years old, lost the house she'd lived in for 50 years before the legal challenge could catch up. The kitchen was very quiet. "What happened to the company?" Margaret asked. "Restructured. New name, new representative, new city." Another pause. "Same ownership." Margaret absorbed this. "So Forsythe isn't the top," she said. "Forsythe is the face," Ethan said. "Carmen's contact is pulling the corporate registration records tonight. There's a chain shell companies, holding entities, but it traces back to a developer out of Los Angeles named Victor Crane. He's been doing this for 6 years across 4 counties. Never quite enough for a criminal charge. Always just enough to keep it technically civil. Until now," Margaret said. That's what Carmen said. She stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. The street was dark and quiet and completely ordinary looking, the way streets look when you're standing inside one life and someone has just told you round that the grunderet has been softer than you knew. "Ethan," she said, "how many people on this street might have signed something?" "We don't know yet. Carmen thinks we need to talk to every resident over 70 within a 3-block radius before Forsythe has time to move anything." "He'll know we're coming," Margaret said. "He came to my door the morning after the incident on 5th Street. He knows I'm not going to stay quiet." "I know," Ethan said. "That's why we need to move fast." She thought about Evelyn Morse, about Harold Birch, about Jerry Patel going quiet after a week when his son was out of town. She thought about how many conversations had happened on this street that she hadn't been present for, how many front doors had opened to a well-dressed man with a briefcase and closed again with something signed that shouldn't have been. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Early, 7 o'clock. Carmen will have the legal framework. Ray's already made some calls. There are four of us who can cover the street in pairs. I'm going with Carmen, Margaret said. These are my neighbors. They'll talk more easily if I'm there. A brief pause on his end. She knew what the pause meant, the same calculation he always ran when she said something that required him to weigh her safety against her judgment, and the same conclusion he always arrived at, because he had learned, over decades, that her judgment was not something you successfully argued with. Okay, he said. 7 o'clock. Get some sleep. You too, she said. She went to bed at midnight. She slept, which surprised her, and dreamed about nothing she could remember, which was a mercy. 7 o'clock arrived gray and cold, the kind of October morning that smells like the last of something, and Margaret had coffee ready when Carmen knocked on the door at 6:58. Carmen looked like someone who had slept for 4 hours and was running on legal strategy and something from a coffee shop. She had a leather bag over one shoulder that was thick with files, and she had the focused, forward-leaning posture of a person who has spent the night assembling information into a shape that can be used. Victor Crane, she said, before she'd even sat down. 61 years old, Los Angeles-based developer. Principal shareholder in a holding company called Pacific Gradient Properties, which controls 7 subsidiary entities, including Clearwater Property Partners. He's been investigated twice in the past 6 years, once in Riverside, once in San Bernardino, and both times the investigation stalled because the signatures on the documents were technically obtained voluntarily, and the victims either settled quietly or couldn't sustain the legal fight. Margaret poured her a coffee. Sit down. Carmen sat. She opened the leather bag. The corporate veil is the problem. Everything Crane does is filtered through enough layers that direct culpability is hard to establish. Forsyth is his field operator. He's done this in at least 2 other cities that I can trace. The pattern is always the same. Identify a neighborhood where property values are climbing, target elderly residents with limited family support, use social engineering to collect signatures before anyone can consult legal counsel, then leverage those signatures to either force a sale or create enough legal ambiguity to devalue the resistance. It's designed to exhaust people, Margaret said. Exactly, Carmen said. The legal fights cost money and time and energy that most 80-year-olds don't have. Some of them don't have the resources. Some of them have the resources but not the stamina. And some of them, she paused, some of them are so ashamed of having signed something they didn't understand that they never tell their children. And by the time anyone finds out, Crane's people have already moved to the next stage. Margaret thought about Evelyn sitting across the table saying, I signed it because I didn't want him to think I was being difficult. What do we need? She asked. Testimony, Carmen said. Every person who was approached, every conversation they can remember, every document they were shown or asked to sign. If I can establish a pattern of undue influence, specifically targeting vulnerable adults, using pressure tactics that don't look like pressure tactics on the surface, I can build a case under California's elder financial abuse statutes that is actually prosecutable, not just civilly challengeable. And if someone already signed something binding, Carmen looked at her steadily. There are grounds to challenge, especially if the person didn't have independent legal counsel at the time, didn't fully understand the document's implications, or signed under circumstances we can characterize as coercive. She paused. It's harder, but it's not impossible. Margaret nodded. She thought about the order she wanted to do this in. She thought about Evelyn, first the most urgent, because of the form she'd signed, then Harold, and then Jerry, and then the others she was less sure about, the ones whose signals she'd caught out of the corner of her attention over the past weeks and hadn't yet had a direct conversation with. We start with Evelyn, she said. She's going to be embarrassed, and she's going to want to minimize what happened. Don't let her. You know her well, Carmen said. For 23 years, Margaret said. I know what she sounds like when she's telling herself something is less serious than it is. Carmen picked up her coffee. Lead the way. Evelyn Morse answered the door in her housecoat, which meant she hadn't expecting company, which meant the phone call Margaret had made the night before, just to say she would be stopping by in the morning. Nothing specific. No alarm raised, had not fully registered as significant. Evelyn's face went through three distinct expressions. In the 2 seconds after, she opened the door and found Margaret on the step with a woman she didn't know, carrying a bag full of files. The first expression was surprise. The second was that particular quality of recognition that happens when a person realizes, faster than they can form the thought consciously, that something they have been quietly dreading has arrived. The third was the thing that Margaret had been watching for: the straightening of the spine, the lift of the chin, the specific dignity that certain women of a certain generation pull on like armor when they feel exposed. Evelyn Morse had spent 83 years refusing to let anyone see her frightened. "Come in," she said. They sat in Evelyn's living room, which smelled like lavender and Earl Grey and the particular warmth of a home that has been carefully maintained for decades. Carmen introduced herself quietly, and without legal vocabulary. She was a friend of Margaret's son. She was helping some of the neighbors with some paperwork questions, and Evelyn nodded with the wariness of someone being handled gently and not entirely sure if she appreciated it. "What did I sign?" Evelyn said. She directed the question at Margaret rather than Carmen because she trusted Margaret's translation. Carmen pulled out a printed copy of a standard property partners form. She had obtained the template through her contact at the DA's office and slid it across the coffee table. "This is what's called a right of first negotiation agreement," Carmen said. "In plain terms, it means the person who signed it has agreed to give Clearwater Property Partners the first opportunity to make an offer on their property before they can sell it to anyone else. It doesn't force a sale, but it means I can't sell to anyone else without going through them first," Evelyn said. "If the form you signed matches this template, yes. And if I decide I don't want to sell at all, the agreement typically includes a clause requiring you to formally notify them of that decision, at which point they have a 60-day window to make a counteroffer." Carmen paused. "During those 60 days, they can also use the agreement as leverage in ways that can make simply staying in your home administratively complicated." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. "He told me it was just an expression of interest," she said. Those were his exact words. "Just an expression of interest." "I know," Carmen said. "That's the language they use. It's designed to sound informal." "It's a lie," Evelyn said. "Very flat, very clear. 83 years old and still capable of calling a thing what it was." "It's a misrepresentation," Carmen said carefully. "It's a lie," Evelyn repeated. "He looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't signing anything significant, and I believed him, and it was a lie." The room was very still. Then Evelyn looked at Margaret. "What do I do?" "You talk to Carmen," Margaret said. "You tell her everything you remember, every visit, every conversation, every word he used. And then Carmen does what she does." "In my house?" Evelyn said. "My daughter, call her today," Margaret said. "After we finish here. She's going to be so upset with me." "She's going to be upset on your behalf," Margaret said. "That's different." Evelyn looked down at the form on the coffee table. Then she looked up at Carmen. "How long do we have before they try to use this?" "I don't know," Carmen said honestly. "That's why we're moving today." Evelyn took a breath. A long one, the kind that carries more than air. "All right," she said. "Ask me your questions." Harold Birch came to his door before Margaret could knock. He had been watching for her from the window. She could tell by the speed of his arrival, by the fact that he was already in his day clothes at 7:45 in the morning, which was unusual for a man who had told her more than once that one of the genuine pleasures of being 81 was that no one expected you to be dressed before 9. "Something's happening," he said. "Yes," she said. "Can we come in?" He held the door open. Carmen introduced herself. Harold looked at her bag of files and said, "How bad? We're still assessing," Carmen said. "How bad?" Harold said again, looking at Margaret. "Bad enough that we're not going to let it get worse," Margaret said. He sat down heavily in the chair that was clearly his, worn at the armrests, in the precise shape of how he spent his evenings, and he looked at his hands for a moment. "I didn't sign anything," he said. "I want to say that first. He put the papers in front of me twice, and I didn't sign." "I know," Margaret said. "You told me, but I also didn't tell anyone," he said. "Not after I told you, And then I watched him park in front of Evelyn's house the next week, and I didn't go over there. I didn't call her. He looked up. I keep thinking about that. That I knew, and I watched, and I didn't go over. The shame in his voice was so precise and so familiar that Margaret felt it in her own chest. Harold, she said, I'm 81 years old, and I've been watching this neighborhood since before half these people moved in, and I sat in this chair, and I watched that man walk into Evelyn's house, and I didn't do anything. His voice was tight, not tearful. Harold Birch was not a man who cried easily but tight, in the way of someone pressing against something that hurts. I'm not sure I can explain why. I think I told myself it wasn't my business. I think I told myself she was a grown woman and could handle her own affairs. A pause. And I think I was afraid that if I made noise about it, he'd come back. The honesty of that last sentence landed in the room like something set down carefully. He would have come back, regardless, Margaret said. That's not on you. I should have called you, he said. You told me, she said. When you needed to, you told me. That's why we're here now. He looked at Carmen. What do you need from me? Everything you remember, Carmen said. Every conversation, every visit, everything he said, every document he put in front of you, even if you didn't sign it. The verbal communications matter as much as the paperwork, what he implied, how he made you feel, the language he used around timeline and pressure. Harold nodded slowly. He sat up slightly in his chair. He came 4 times, he said. The first time was September 2nd. I remember because it was the day after Labor Day, and I'd just gotten back from my nephew's in Sacramento. Carmen opened her legal pad. Harold talked for an hour and 15 minutes. His memory was precise dates, language, the exact phrasing Forsyth had used about a man in your position, and getting ahead of the change, and the names of neighbors he had claimed were already in discussions. Carmen wrote without interrupting, and Margaret sat quietly, and Harold talked with the methodical care of a man who understood that he was building something and wanted it built right. When he finished, he said, Is that enough? It's very good, Carmen said. You have an excellent memory. I do the crossword in pen, he said. You have to stay sharp. Margaret stood to leave, and Harold caught her arm. Margaret, his voice had dropped. Jerry Patel at the corner house. Go today. He's been having a hard time with his heart medication, and his son won't be back until next weekend. If Forsyth went back to him, we're going next, she said. He nodded. He held her arm for just a second longer. I'm glad you made noise, he said, on 5th Street. I'm glad you didn't just let it pass. I'm not built for letting things pass, she said. Something in his face shifted the specific expression of a person hearing something that reassures them not about the future, but about the past. About all the moments that led here. No, he said, you're not. Jerry Patel's front door took 3 knocks, which was unusual, because Jerry was typically the kind of neighbor who appeared at the door before you finished the first knock, hospitable in the reflexive way of someone raised in a culture where a guest on your doorstep was an event of genuine significance. The delay was the first signal. He answered looking smaller than Margaret remembered. Not thinner, not visibly unwell, just that particular quality of compression that comes over people when they are carrying something heavy and have been carrying it alone long enough that the weight has started to reshape them from the inside. Margaret, he said. And then seeing Carmen, oh, I see. Can we come in, Jerry? He stepped back. He didn't offer tea, which told her more than any of his words would for the next several minutes. He sat at his kitchen table, and he looked at his own hands, and he said, How much do you know? Tell us what happened, Margaret said. We'll fill in what we have. He had signed 2 documents. The first was the same right of first negotiation agreement Evelyn had signed. The second, and this was what made Carmen stop writing for 3 full seconds when he slid it across the table, was a preliminary sale agreement, not binding until a formal appraisal and a 30-day review period, but a preliminary agreement that established a price range and Clearwater Property Partners' right to move to contract within 90 days. He came back when my son was away, Jerry said. I told him my son handles these things. He said there was nothing here that required family involvement, that I was a competent adult perfectly capable of making my own decisions. He paused. I'm 78 years old. I do not like being told I am not capable of making my own decisions. Carmen looked up. He used that, she said, deliberately. I understand that now, Jerry said quietly. At the time, I was angry in a way that made me want to prove him wrong. So I read the document, and I couldn't follow. All of it, the language is very specific, but I could follow the price, it wasn't a bad number. It seemed like a fair number. He paused. And he said the number would only be available for that week. That the neighborhood assessment was being finalized, and after that the offers would be different. Artificial urgency, Carmen said. Yes, Jerry said. I understand that also. Now, he looked at Margaret. I signed it because I felt that refusing was the foolish choice. He made me feel like refusing was the foolish choice. A pause. My wife would have known better. She always knew. She always knew when someone was selling something underneath what they were actually selling. The mention of his wife sat in the room with its own weight. Margaret had known Priya Patel had known her for 17 years before she died of cancer 3 years ago, had sat with Jerry through the days immediately after, had understood in watching him that the specific thing he had lost was not just a person, but an entire way of seeing clearly. Can it be challenged? Jerry asked Carmen. Yes, Carmen said. The preliminary agreement has several vulnerabilities. The urgency language he described is coercive on its face. The fact that he explicitly discouraged you from consulting your son, that's potentially grounds for undue influence. And the price he offered you. She paused. Looking at the number Jerry had written at the top of the copy is significantly below current market value for your property. We can challenge this. Jerry was quiet. Will it be difficult? He asked. It won't be simple, Carmen said. But you have Margaret's testimony about the pattern of targeting. You have at least 2 other neighbors in similar positions. And you have documentation that the same company has done this before in other cities. Jerry looked at his hands again. I didn't tell Rohit, he said, his son's name. I kept thinking I would wait until I understood it better. And then I kept understanding it worse, and I kept not telling him. His jaw worked. He's going to want to help you, Margaret said. That's all. He works very hard, Jerry said. He doesn't need Jerry. She said it with the gentleness she had learned was the only register that got through to men of a certain generation when their pride was involved. Your son needs to know, and not because you can't handle it, because he loves you, and because you would want to know if the situation were reversed. Jerry Patel looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something in Gujarati, very quietly, that Margaret didn't understand, but that Carmen, who caught the sound of it, later told her translated roughly as, she's right. She's been right about everything. Call him, Margaret said. I'll call him today, Jerry said. By noon, they had spoken with 9 residents. 6 had been approached by Forsyth. 3 of those 6 had signed documents, Evelyn and Jerry, with the forms Carmen had identified. And a third, a woman named Ruth Calloway, at number 58, who had signed something she described as a neighborhood survey that was, Carmen confirmed when she saw the copy, an information release form that gave Clearwater Property Partners access to property tax records and prior sale history, not legally binding in the same way as the others, but part of the same gathering mechanism, the slow accumulation of information and access that preceded the more aggressive stages. Ruth was 69 and furious in a way that the older residents had not quite permitted themselves to be. I want to sue them, she said, before Carmen had finished her sentence. That may be possible, Carmen said. But first, I want to sue them personally, Ruth said. I want Daniel Forsyth to know that the neighborhood survey woman knows a lawyer. Carmen looked at her with something that might have been professional appreciation. Let me make some calls, Carmen said. They were back at Margaret's kitchen table by 1 o'clock. Ethan was already there. He had spent the morning with Ray and 2 other chapter members making their own inquiries, the kind that didn't involve legal pads, but involved the kind of specific local knowledge that comes from knowing every business owner and mechanic and bar staff and parking lot attendant within 8 blocks. He had found something. The temporary office on 5th Street, he said, opened 6 weeks ago. It's listed as a commercial real estate consultation space. But 3 of the people who work out of it have direct ties to Pacific Gradient Properties, Crane's holding company. One of them is Forsyth's assistant, a woman who's been with him in 2 other cities. He set up infrastructure, Carmen said. He's planning something longer than a few signatures, Ethan said. The office, the staff, this isn't a quick pass. He's committed to this neighborhood specifically. Carmen looked at her files. Then she looked at Ethan. Then she looked at Margaret. I need to call the DA's office directly, she said. What we have now, the pattern across multiple victims, the corporate trail to Crane, the prior investigations in Riverside and San Bernardino, the documented use of coercive language, this is enough to initiate a formal investigation. It's not enough to guarantee charges, but it's enough to bring in people with subpoena power. How long does that take? Margaret asked. If my contact is available today, days, not weeks. And in the meantime, Ethan said. Carmen looked at him directly. In the meantime, nobody signs anything. Nobody meets with Forsyth or anyone from his office without me present. And if he shows up at anyone's door, he won't be comfortable, Ethan said. It was said quietly. It was said in the same register as everything Ethan said, measured, unhurried, with the weight of someone who means what he says and doesn't need to add anything to it. Carmen looked at him for a beat. She was too precise a person to miss what he meant, and too smart a lawyer to ask him to clarify it. I'll make the call to the DA, she said. She stepped into the hallway. Margaret looked at her son. What aren't you telling me? She said. Ethan looked at her steadily. Nothing that changes what we're doing, Ethan. He picked up his coffee. He turned it in his hands. He had his father's habit of that, the handling of warm things while he thought. Forsyth came to your door the morning after the incident on 5th Street, he said. That timing matters. He knew your name. He knew your address. He came specifically to you, specifically then. He paused. I don't think that was coincidental. I think he came because someone told him you were becoming a problem. Brandon, Margaret said. Maybe, Ethan said. Or someone connected to Brandon. Or someone who saw what happened on 5th Street and reported it to someone who cared. You think there's a direct connection, she said, between what those boys did on the sidewalk and Crane's operation. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I think it's possible, he said carefully. That in a neighborhood where someone is running a deliberate campaign to make elderly residents feel unsafe and isolated, 3 young men harassing an old woman on the street is either a coincidence or it isn't. The sentence landed in the kitchen and sat there. Margaret thought about Brandon Keller on that sidewalk, the confidence of him, the practiced quality of the cruelty, not explosive, not uncontrolled, but measured out in specific doses. Shut up, old lady. Nobody cares about you. She had taken those words as the careless brutality of youth. But what if they were something more specific than careless? What if the point had not been to hurt her, but to make her afraid? To make her feel, on the street she had lived on for 41 years, that she was small and unwatched and unprotected. And if that was true, if the encounter on 5th Street had been not random cruelty, but a message from someone who wanted her to know her place, then what Forsyth was running was not just a real estate scheme. It was a territory. We need to know, she said. We will, Ethan said. Ray's working on it. Carmen came back into the kitchen. The DA's office, she said, and there was something in her voice that was the controlled excitement of a person who has just had a door open that they've been pushing on for a long time. My contact there, Jessica Thorne, she's been building a case file on Pacific Gradient Properties for 8 months. She had Riverside. She had San Bernardino. She didn't have enough for a clean pattern. Carmen paused. She does now. The kitchen held that for a moment. She wants everything we have, Carmen said. All of it. Evelyn, Harold, Jerry, Ruth, every conversation, every document, every date. She can subpoena Clearwater Property Partners records directly, which means we can get to the actual documents. The full list of residents they approached, the internal communications. When? Margaret asked. She's filing the request for a formal investigation tomorrow morning, Carmen said. She asked me to tell the residents not to speak to anyone from Clearwater Property Partners until she's had a chance to make contact. And Forsyth? Ethan said. As of this afternoon, Carmen said carefully, he should probably consider the window on this particular neighborhood closed. Ethan nodded. Then he looked at his mother. You okay? He said. It was the same question he had asked her on 5th Street, outside Cafe Remy, after he had cut his engine and swung off his bike and walked 3 steps toward her and stopped. He asked it the same way, plainly, without preface, because it was always the first and most important question. Margaret thought about Evelyn's face when she recognized what she'd signed. She thought about Harold, saying, I sat in this chair and I watched and I didn't do anything. She thought about Jerry Patel, alone in his kitchen for weeks with the weight of it, waiting for his son to come home and not knowing how to begin. She thought about all the ways a neighborhood can be made to feel afraid without anyone raising their voice. And she thought about what it meant that it was her, an old woman carrying groceries, a woman everyone had always underestimated, a woman who had spent 41 years quietly showing up, who had made enough noise to bring all of this into the light. I'm okay, she said. Good, Ethan said. There's something you should know. Though, she said. He looked at her. When I was standing on that sidewalk, she said, with those boys in front of me and the chain just broken before I called you. In those first few seconds, I was not afraid. I know, he said. I was not afraid, she repeated, because I knew that whatever those boys thought they were doing, they had already made the mistake of doing it in front of witnesses, in front of a street full of people who know me. She paused. And I knew that the moment I made that call, the story stopped being about whether I was alone. Ethan was very still. But here's what I keep thinking about, she said. Evelyn, Harold, Jerry. They didn't call anyone. They carried it alone for weeks. And the reason they carried it alone, she stopped. She found the words she'd been looking for. Since this morning, the reason they carried it alone is that they didn't know what I know. What do you know? Carmen asked quietly. Margaret looked at her son. She looked at Carmen. She looked at her kitchen table where the coffee cups were and the legal pads were and the business card of a man who had parked his gray sedan in front of her house, thinking she was someone he could manage. That being alone is not the same as being without people, she said. That the people who love you are waiting to be asked. She paused. I forgot that for a while. I had to be reminded. She looked at Ethan. My son reminded me. The same way I used to remind him. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the October afternoon had gone still, and Birchwood Lane was doing what it had always done, continuing, breathing, persisting. But something was different in it now. Something that had been accumulating invisibly for months. A pressure, a wrongness, a slow, systematic campaign against the people who had built their lives on this particular stretch of ground. That thing had been named today. It had been brought out of the silent spaces behind closed doors and set in the light of a legal pad, a phone call to a DA's office, and a kitchen table in a house that had been here for 41 years. And it was not going back into the dark. Margaret Whitmore stood up from her kitchen table. She took the cups to the sink. She ran the water and thought about Evelyn, calling her daughter in Portland, and Harold finishing his crossword and Jerry dialing his son's number. She thought about Ruth Calloway saying, I want to sue them personally, and the look on Carmen's face. She thought about Jessica Thorne at the DA's office. 8 months of a case file, waiting for the piece that made the pattern complete. She turned off the water. Tomorrow morning, she said, what do we need to do? Carmen had her legal pad ready before the question was finished. Jessica Thorne arrived at Margaret's house at 8 o'clock the following morning in a department vehicle with a colleague named Paul Okafor, who was younger than her by about a decade and carried himself with the particular alertness of someone still building the instincts that Thorne had clearly had for years. Thorne herself was 52, compact, with gray at her temples, and the kind of handshake that communicates exactly one thing: I don't waste time. She had been with the California Department of Justice's Elder Financial Abuse Unit for 11 years. And in those 11 years, she had learned to read a neighborhood the way other people read weather, not by what was visible on the surface, but by the pressure systems underneath. She had been reading Clearwater Ridge for 8 months from a distance. Now she was in Margaret Whitmore's kitchen, and the distance was gone. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, Setting her bag on the table with the ease of someone accustomed to commandeering kitchen tables, Carmen tells me you've been working this street for 3 weeks on your own. I've been paying attention, Margaret said. There's a difference. Thorne looked at her for a beat. Fair enough. She opened the bag. Let me tell you what I have, and then you tell me what fills in the gaps. What Thorne had was substantial. 8 months of financial filings, corporate registration records, transaction histories, and the documented aftermath of what Victor Crane's network had done in Riverside and San Bernardino. She had names and dates and dollar amounts. She had the shapes of 2 prior investigations that had stalled not for lack of evidence, but for lack of a clean enough pattern, something a defense attorney couldn't pick apart by isolating each incident and argue individual consent. What she had needed was the connective tissue. What Margaret had given her, through Carmen, was exactly that. In Riverside, Thorne said, 11 people signed documents. 3 of them contested. Only 1 was able to sustain the legal fight long enough to get a hearing, and by then Crane had restructured the subsidiary, and the chain of liability had too many gaps. She paused. In San Bernardino, 7 people, same pattern. Forsyth was the field operator in both cities. Same man, Margaret said. Same man. Different business card. Thorne slid a photograph across the table. Is this him? Margaret looked at it. The man in the photograph was younger, maybe 3 years younger, taken from what appeared to be a surveillance image outside a real estate office, but the face was unmistakable. The calibrated friendliness, the quality of practiced warmth. That's him, she said. Thorne made a note. Here's what I need you to understand, Thorne said. What we're building here is not just a case against Forsyth. Forsyth is the instrument. The case is against Crane and the structure he's built to insulate himself from direct liability. To get to Crane, I need to demonstrate that what happened on Birchwood Lane is not a series of individual transactions, but a coordinated predatory campaign with a single directing intelligence behind it. And what we've gathered gives you that? Carmen asked. It gets us closer than I've been in 8 months, Thorne said. She looked at Margaret. But there's something Carmen mentioned that I want to ask you about directly. Margaret waited. The incident on 5th Street, Thorne said. The 3 young men, Brandon Keller and his associates, Margaret said. You told Carmen you thought the timing of Forsyth's visit the following morning might not have been coincidental. I told Carmen it was a possibility I couldn't rule out, Margaret said, precisely. Thorne nodded. It's a possibility I can't rule out either. She paused. Brandon Keller has a prior connection to a property maintenance company called Clearview Services that did contract work for Pacific Gradient Properties in San Bernardino 18 months ago. The kitchen went very quiet. Paul Okafor, who had been taking notes since he sat down, stopped writing. Carmen looked up from her files. Margaret placed both hands flat on the kitchen table. Say that again, she said. Brandon Keller worked 3 months for Clearview Services as a day laborer during the San Bernardino operation, Thorne said. Clearview is a shell that exists on paper as a facilities maintenance company, but its primary function appears to be providing untraceable ground-level personnel for Crane's operations. We found the connection 2 weeks ago, and we've been trying to establish whether Keller was recruited for a specific function here or whether it was incidental. It wasn't incidental, Margaret said. No, Thorne said. Probably not. The shape of it assembled itself in Margaret's mind with a clarity that was almost physical. The 3 boys on the sidewalk. The specific location outside the block where the Clearwater Property Partners office had opened. The measured quality of the harassment, not random cruelty but something targeted, something designed to make a particular woman feel unsafe on her own street. Forsyth at her door the next morning, knowing her name, knowing her address, arriving at the precise moment when someone who had been just frightened might be most receptive to a conversation about whether staying in this neighborhood was still the right choice. A message. It had been a message. You are not as safe as you think you are. You are not as protected as you believe. Your street is changing, and you are going to be left behind by it. Sign here. He sent them, Margaret said. Not a question. We believe Keller was given a target, Thorne said carefully. We believe the encounter on 5th Street was intended to serve the same function as the conversations Forsyth was having behind closed doors, to create the psychological conditions that make a sale feel like the rational choice. She paused. "You were not supposed to call your son." Margaret looked at her. "You were supposed to go home frightened," Thorne said. "And Forsyth was supposed to knock on your door the next day and be the most reasonable, helpful presence you'd encountered all week." The silence in the kitchen had a different quality now. Not the silence of shock, exactly. Margaret was not easily shocked, but the silence of a person who has just seen the full dimensions of a thing they had been measuring from one side. She thought about Brandon Keller's face in the moment he understood what was coming down the street toward him. She had read it as the fear of a young man encountering consequences for the first time. She had been right about that, but she had not known, until this moment, the full context of what those consequences were for. He had not just harassed an old woman. He had been working. "How old is he?" Margaret said. 19, Thorne said. "Does he understand?" Margaret said slowly. "What he was actually part of." Thorne looked at her with an expression that was assessing something. "That's a question his attorney is going to have to answer." "I'm asking what you think," Margaret said. Thorne held her gaze for a moment. "I think he understood that someone was paying him to make people feel unsafe," she said. Whether he understood the full scope of the financial operation behind it, probably not. Young men in his position are useful precisely because they don't ask detailed questions. Margaret thought about that. She thought about 19 years old and a connection to a maintenance company in another city, and someone handing you a name and an address and a specific instruction, and the particular vulnerability of a young person who needs money and doesn't yet understand the weight of what they're being asked to carry. She was not going to feel sorry for Brandon Keller. He had grabbed her necklace and told her nobody cared about her, and she had not forgotten, and she was not going to minimize it. But she was going to hold the complete picture, because incomplete pictures were how people made the wrong decisions. "What do you need from us today?" Carmen said. Thorne turned back to her files. "I need formal statements from every resident who was approached. I need the original documents wherever they still exist, Evelyn Morse's form, Jerry Patel's preliminary agreement, Ruth Calloway's information release. I need dates, times, the specific language Forsyth used in each visit." She paused. "And I need to know if there are residents I haven't identified yet. People who were approached and didn't tell anyone." "There are," Margaret said. "I'm almost certain of it." "How certain?" "The woman at number 37, Margaret said. Agnes Beaumont. 68 years old, widowed 2 years ago. Her son lives in Seattle. She's been different for the past month. Quieter. She canceled our Tuesday coffee twice, which she's never done in 6 years. You haven't spoken to her yet?" "I was going to go today." Thorne looked at her for a moment. "Mrs. Whitmore, can I ask you something?" "You can." "How long have you been paying this close attention to this street?" Margaret considered the question genuinely. 41 years, she said. "But more deliberately since Harold told me about the first visit." "About 3 weeks. And in 3 weeks you identified 6 approached residents, 3 signed documents, and a pattern of behavior that my office has been trying to establish for 8 months. I knew the people," Margaret said simply. "You were working from documents. I was working from people." Thorne looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was the closest thing to genuine admiration that a person with 11 years in elder financial abuse prosecution is likely to show at 8 o'clock in the morning. "I want you with me today," Thorne said. "When we go to Agnes Beaumont and anyone else you've flagged, your presence will make people talk who won't talk to a badge." "All right," Margaret said. "One condition," Thorne said. "What's that?" "You tell me before you do anything. No more 3 weeks of solo reconnaissance." Margaret looked at her evenly. "I'll tell you when I have something worth telling." Thorne assessed this. "I'll take it," she said. Agnes Beaumont answered the door on the first knock, which meant she'd been expecting someone, or dreading someone, or both. She looked at Margaret, and something in her face went through the same sequence Margaret had seen in Evelyn's face 3 days ago: the recognition, the dread, and then the armor coming up. But the armor, this time, was slower. I wondered when you'd come, Agnes said. Can we come in? Margaret said. She introduced Thorne as someone helping to sort out some problems on the street, the same low-key framing she had used with Evelyn, because the word investigator had a way of making people retreat rather than open. They sat in Agnes's living room, and Agnes looked at her own hands for a moment, and then looked at Margaret and said, he came to me 4 times. 4 times was more than anyone else they had spoken to. The first time was the second week of September, Agnes said. He was very kind. He brought me a card with his company's information, and he asked if I had ever thought about what my plans were for this house, given that I was managing it alone. She paused. I told him I wasn't alone. I told him my son called every Sunday. He said she stopped. Take your time, Margaret said. He said that a weekly phone call was wonderful, but that it wasn't the same as having family nearby. He said that the money from a sale could give me real options. I could move closer to my son. I could afford better care if I needed it. I could stop worrying. Her voice had gone tight. He knew I worried about being a burden. He knew exactly where to put that. How did he know? Thorne asked quietly. Agnes looked at her. I don't know how he knew. I've asked myself that. I never told him, not directly. But he knew the right questions to make me say it. She paused. He said, it can be hard to maintain a home at this stage of life. Have you found it's getting harder? And I said, yes, because it is. And then he nodded, like I'd confirmed something he already understood. And he put the papers on the table. Thorne's pen was moving steadily. Did you sign anything? Margaret asked. Agnes was quiet for a moment. The 4th time he came, she said, I signed a priority notification agreement. He said it just meant they would contact me first if properties in the area were going to be reassessed. It sounded like something that protected me. She looked at Margaret. He framed everything as protection. That's what they do, Margaret said. I know that now, Agnes said. I didn't know it then. She reached into the drawer of the side table beside her chair and removed a folder. She handed it to Thorne. I kept everything, she said. Every card, every paper, every note I made after he left, because my son always told me to write things down after important conversations. I wrote down what he said, his exact words as best as I could remember. Thorne opened the folder. She was quiet for several seconds, reading. Then she looked up at Agnes with the specific quality of attention that Margaret had come to recognize as Thorne's version of something significant. Mrs. Beaumont, she said, did he ever mention the name Victor Crane? Agnes's expression shifted. Once. The last time he was here, he said that Mr. Crane, he said it, like I should know the name, had personally reviewed the properties on Birchwood Lane and considered this area a priority for their portfolio. She paused. He said it like it was a compliment, like I should be flattered that someone important had noticed my house. And you wrote this down, Thorne said. Word for word, Agnes said. My son taught me to write things down. Thorne looked at Okafor, a look that carried an entire conversation in it. Mrs. Beaumont, Thorne said carefully. What you have in this folder may be the most directly useful thing I've seen in 8 months of working this case. Agnes looked at her. He said Crane's name, Thorne said. On the record. Written down contemporaneously by a witness. That is direct linkage from the field operation to the principal. That is exactly the connective tissue a defense attorney cannot explain away as coincidence. Agnes looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at her. I just wrote down what he said, Agnes said. I know, Margaret said. That's enough. The formal investigation opened the following morning. Thorne filed with the DA's office at 9 a.m. and had a response by 11, a speed that Carmen told Margaret was almost unheard of, a reflection of how complete the package was and how long the DA's office had been waiting for something solid enough to move on. Forsyth was served with a preservation order before noon, requiring Clearwater Property Partners to preserve all documents, communications, and records related to properties in Clearwater Ridge. The order extended to Pacific Gradient Properties and its 7 subsidiaries. Daniel Forsyth's gray sedan was not parked in front of the 5th Street office when the order was served. The office was empty. Not vacated, the furniture was still there. The signage was still in the window. but empty in the way of a space where someone has taken the important things and left the furniture because furniture is replaceable. Ethan called Margaret at 12:15. He ran, she said, before he could. Someone tipped him, he said. Do we know who? Not yet. The possibility of a leak someone connected to the investigation who had warned Forsyth hung in the air of the conversation, and neither of them addressed it directly because there was nothing to be done about a possibility until it became a certainty. Does it matter? Margaret asked. He ran, but the documents are preserved. The records are already in Thorne's hands. The testimony is on record. It matters for the criminal case, Ethan said. A civil claim against the subsidiaries is one thing. Getting Crane on criminal elder abuse charges requires. Thorne knows what it requires, Margaret said. Let her work. A pause. You trust her, Ethan said. I trust competent people who want the right things, Margaret said. She's both. Okay, he said. But Mom, I know, she said. I'm being careful. She wasn't sure that was entirely true, but she believed it enough to say it. Brandon Keller's hearing was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks into November. Margaret had not planned to attend. She had given her statement. She had done what the prosecution needed from her, and she had told herself that the hearing was Thorne's domain and the DA's domain and not something that required her presence. She went anyway. She sat in the third row of the gallery with her purse in her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and she watched the proceeding with the same quiet attention she brought to everything. Brandon sat at the defendant's table in a jacket that was clearly borrowed. The fit was wrong at the shoulders, and he looked smaller than he had on Fifth Street. Not frightened exactly, but diminished. The particular quality of a person who has had several weeks to sit with what they've done and has not been able to find a comfortable position in relation to it. His mother was in the first row of the gallery. Margaret had not expected that. She was a woman in her mid-40s, plain-faced and tired in the way of someone for whom tiredness had become the baseline. And she held herself very still in a way that communicated the specific grief of a parent watching a child face consequences and understanding clearly that the consequences are real and deserved and unavoidable. Margaret recognized that particular grief. She had never felt it about Ethan. Her son had made choices she'd had concerns about, but not this. Never anything like this, but she recognized the shape of it from watching other mothers over the years. And she felt, against her own wishes, the pull of compassion for the woman in the first row. Not for Brandon, not yet, and maybe not ever, not fully, but for his mother. The DA's presentation established 3 counts: assault, theft, and the addition that had come from Thorne's investigation conspiracy to commit elder financial fraud, which elevated the case significantly from the original charges. Brandon's attorney, a young public defender who was doing his best with a difficult situation, entered a not guilty plea on all counts and requested a continuance to examine the new conspiracy charge. The continuance was granted. As the proceeding wound down and the gallery began to shift, Brandon turned in his seat and his eyes moved across the room and found Margaret. She held his gaze. He didn't look away, which surprised her. She had expected the ducked head, the studied avoidance of the person who has wronged you. What she got instead was something more complicated, a young man looking directly at the woman he had put in this room, in this situation, with the specific expression of someone who has processed enough to understand what he's done, but not yet enough to know what to do with that understanding. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded. Once, very slightly. It was not forgiveness. She was not prepared to offer that, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. But it was acknowledgement, the recognition that whatever he had done and whoever had pointed him at her, he was also 19 years old and had allowed himself to be used for something he was not equipped to fully understand. She did not owe him that acknowledgement. She gave it anyway, because she was Margaret Whitmore, and because the shape of her character did not change based on who was receiving it. Brandon looked away. His mother in the first row had been watching this. She turned and found Margaret in the third row and looked at her with an expression that was impossible to fully read: gratitude and shame and something else, something rawer than either of those. Margaret met her eyes briefly. Then she gathered her purse and stood and walked out of the courtroom. Victor Crane was served with a criminal complaint on the 4th of December. Margaret heard about it from Carmen, who heard about it from Thorne, who called at 7 in the evening, with the particular controlled satisfaction of a person who has been working towards something for a very long time and has finally arrived. The charges were serious: elder financial abuse, conspiracy, fraudulent business practices, and 3 counts related to the use of intimidation through third parties, the last category being the one that tied Crane directly to Brandon Keller and encounter on 5th Street. Agnes's notes, Carmen said. Forsyth using Crane's name directly. That was the thread that pulled the whole thing through. Agnes Beaumont's son taught her to write things down after important conversations, Margaret said. Carmen laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. I'm going to tell her that when I call her. Do, Margaret said. She'll like hearing it. The challenge to Evelyn's right of first negotiation agreement was filed the same week. Carmen had assembled a case under California's elder abuse statutes that the opposing counsel, a Los Angeles firm representing Pacific Gradient Properties, immediately recognized as substantive. The response was not aggressive counter-argument. It was the cautious, hedging language of people who understand that the ground has shifted. Jerry Patel's preliminary agreement was declared void by a judge the following week on the grounds of undue influence and material misrepresentation, specifically the artificial urgency language Forsyth had used and Jerry's documentation of, being explicitly discouraged from consulting his son. The ruling was 3 pages long and included a passage that Carmen read aloud to Margaret over the phone. The deliberate targeting of an elderly individual in a period of social isolation, combined with the systematic use of pressure tactics designed to replicate the appearance of informed consent, constitutes a violation of both the letter and spirit of California's elder protection statutes. The letter and the spirit, Margaret repeated. That language matters, Carmen said. Judges don't write it unless they want it on record. Ruth Calloway, who had never stopped wanting to sue them personally, was in the process of filing a separate civil claim alongside Thorne's criminal case. Her attorney, not Carmen, a different one. Someone Ruth had found through her daughter, who was a paralegal in Sacramento, had filed something that generated 4 inches of local newspaper coverage and a phone call from a television station in Los Angeles that Margaret declined to take. She declined to take 2 more of those calls. Before Ethan pointed out that the story being told publicly would be told whether she participated or not, and that the version told without her voice might not be the version that served the neighborhood. She thought about that for a day. Then she called the television station back. The interview aired on a Saturday morning and lasted 4 minutes in its edited form, though the conversation behind it had lasted nearly an hour. The journalist was a young woman named Sophia Reeves, who was sharper than her age suggested, and who had the particular quality of listening that Margaret associated with people who genuinely wanted to understand something rather than just gather material for a story they'd already decided to tell. Margaret sat across from her in the living room of the house on Birchwood Lane and answered every question plainly. She talked about the incident on 5th Street. She talked about the broken chain and the grocery bags on the pavement and the phone call she had made. She talked about 27 men on motorcycles arriving at the curb on a Tuesday afternoon because one of their own had called. She talked about Evelyn and Harold and Jerry and Agnes. She talked about an 83-year-old woman signing a document because she didn't want to seem difficult, and a 78-year-old man signing because someone had made him feel that refusing was the foolish choice. She talked about 41 years on this street and the slow, invisible architecture of what had been built against the people who lived here, and the way that architecture was designed to be invisible, designed to look like ordinary business transactions, like voluntary agreements, like freedom of choice, while systematically removing the conditions that made real choice possible. What do you want people to take away from this? Sophia Reeves asked. Margaret thought about it. I want them to understand that the people who do this depend on silence, she said. They depend on people being ashamed of having been deceived. They depend on people believing that asking for help is weakness. They depend on neighbors not talking to each other. She paused. None of those things have to be true. And for elderly residents, specifically, people in the same position as you and your neighbors. Know your neighbors, Margaret said. Pay attention. If something feels wrong, say so. Not necessarily to the police first, not necessarily to a lawyer, first say it to the person next to you. Say it to someone you trust. Because the moment you say it out loud, it stops being something you're carrying alone. Sophia Reeves looked at her for a moment after she finished. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, I have to ask, when those young men were blocking your path on 5th Street, before your son arrived, were you ever tempted to just walk away? Margaret looked at her. I don't walk away from my street, she said. The interview aired and the phone calls started. Not just the television station people. Other people in other neighborhoods, other cities. An elderly man in Fresno who had been approached by a company he just realized had a suspiciously similar name to Clearwater Property Partners. A woman in Sacramento whose mother had signed something she didn't understand 6 months ago. A retired school teacher in Bakersfield who had been watching something similar happen on his block for 2 months and hadn't known who to call. Margaret took the calls at her kitchen table, one by one, in the same way she had always taken everything methodically, without hurry, with complete attention. She took down names and numbers and passed them to Carmen and to Thorne. She did it for 3 days, through a Tuesday and a Wednesday and into a Thursday morning, and on Thursday afternoon, Ethan showed up at her door without calling first, which he knew she generally preferred he not do, and stood in her kitchen and looked at the notepad full of names on the kitchen table. How many? He asked. 31, she said. In 4 days, he looked at her. You've been doing this alone. Carmen knows, she said. Thorne knows. Mom. Ethan. He picked up the notepad and looked at the names. Fresno, Sacramento. Bakersfield, Modesto. 2 in San Jose. 31 people who had seen 4 minutes of television on a Saturday morning and recognized something in it that they had been carrying alone. This is bigger than Birchwood Lane, he said. It was always bigger than Birchwood Lane, she said. I just didn't know how much bigger. He set the notepad down. He looked at her with the expression she had seen his whole life, the one that sat between worry and pride and had never fully resolved into one or the other. What do you need? He said. I need Carmen to be available for follow-up calls, she said. And I need Thorne to know that the scope of what she's investigating is wider than the current filing. I'll call Carmen tonight, he said. Thank you. He didn't leave right away. He stood in her kitchen in the afternoon light and looked at the notepad and at his mother and at the space between them that was full of everything they had been through. In the past 3 weeks, the sidewalk on 5th Street, the gray sedan, Evelyn's kitchen table, Harold's living room, the DA's filing, Agnes Beaumont's folder of handwritten notes. You know what Dad would say, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Your father, Margaret said, would say that I was meddling. Ethan smiled. He would not. He would say it very fondly, she said. And then he would sit down and help me organize the notes. The smile on Ethan's face was the one she associated with his father, not the general shape of it, which was his own, but the specific quality of warmth in it, the way it arrived fully and without qualification. Robert had smiled that way. She had loved Robert for many reasons, but that smile had been one of them from the very beginning. She pressed the pendant at her collarbone. Still here, still yours. Sit down, she said. I'll make coffee. He sat. Outside, the December afternoon was going dark early the way December afternoons do, and the streetlights were coming on along Birchwood Lane one by one. The same way they had come on for 41 years, and the neighborhood was doing what it always did, continuing, breathing, persisting, except that now, in the house, at number 31, there were 31 names written on a notepad and a woman and her son sitting at a kitchen table with coffee. And the silence that Victor Crane and Daniel Forsyth and Brandon Keller had tried to build around this street, block by careful block, was gone. It had been gone since the moment Margaret Whitmore reached into her pocket on 5th Street and made one phone call. She had known, in that moment, exactly what she was doing. She had known that the call would bring her son. and that her son would bring his family, and that his family on a street full of witnesses would make visible the one thing that the men targeting her neighborhood could not afford to have made visible, that she was not alone, that none of them were alone, that the architecture of silence they had been building, careful conversation by careful conversation, carefully worded document by carefully worded document, required the cooperation of people who did not know they were cooperating, and that the moment one person the moment one person said the thing out loud, the architecture began to come apart. 31 names on a notepad. 31 people who had seen 4 minutes on a Saturday morning and recognized something. 31 conversations that would become 31 more pieces of the case that Jessica Thorne was assembling into something that Victor Crane's attorneys in Los Angeles were going to find very difficult to dismantle. Margaret wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. She thought about Evelyn Morse, who had called her daughter in Portland that same afternoon 3 weeks ago, and the call that had lasted 2 hours, and the message Evelyn had left on Margaret's phone. Afterward, that said only, "She's coming to visit, thank you." She thought about Jerry Patel, whose son Rohit had driven down from wherever he'd been the day after. Jerry called him and had sat in his father's kitchen for an entire afternoon and had told his father. Margaret heard secondhand that he was glad his father had finally told him, and that nothing about asking for help made you less than who you were. She thought about Harold Birch, who had called her 2 days ago to say that he had started leaving his door unlocked during the day again, the way he had when the neighborhood was younger, and everyone knew everyone, because he had decided that whatever fear had made him lock, it was not worth the cost of what locking it meant. She thought about Agnes Beaumont, whose son had called from Seattle not just on Sunday but on Tuesday and Thursday too, and who had told Margaret when they had coffee last week that she had stopped canceling and intended to stop canceling for good. She thought about all of it, and she held it, and then she set it down and picked up her coffee and looked at her son. "What happens next with the case?" she asked. Ethan leaned forward. "Crane's attorneys filed a motion to dismiss this morning. Thorne expected it. She says it's a delay tactic. Will it work?" Carmen says no, he said. "Not with what Agnes documented. Not with the paper trail across 4 counties. "Good," Margaret said. "Forsyth is still in the wind," Ethan said. "They found him in Phoenix last week, but he hasn't been extradited yet. Carmen says that might take another month." "Thorne will get him," Margaret said. "Probably," Ethan said. "But Crane is the target. Forsyth's just the face." Margaret nodded. She thought about Daniel Forsyth standing on her front walk with his business card and extended and his practiced smile and the gray sedan running behind him. She thought about the 40 seconds before he drove away. He had believed in that moment that she was someone who could be managed, someone who would take the card, feel the pressure, and eventually open her door. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about her. For the same reason, all of them had been wrong about her. From Brandon Keller on the sidewalk to Victor Crane in Los Angeles assembling shell companies between phone calls. They had seen an old woman. They had not seen what the old woman had built. 41 years of showing up. 41 years of paying attention. 41 years of knowing every person on every block, of sitting with people in their dark hours, of understanding that community was not something that happened to a neighborhood but something you made deliberately, one Tuesday dinner and one knocked on door and one pot of tea at a time. They had targeted Margaret Whitmore because she appeared to be alone. What they had actually targeted was the center of a web they hadn't known to look for. And now they were learning what happened when you disturb something that has 41 years of roots.